Back to this episode of Uncover the Human. We are joined this week by our guest, Taylor Fraser, who is the producer and director of the Foreward podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Taylor.
Hey, thank you both very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us.
We're super excited to have you on. If you could just give the audience a little context about what the Foreward podcast is and a little bit about the whole project.
Sure. So I guess right when COVID was rearing its ugly head for the first time, I decided that it was time for me to start on a personal project that I've been thinking about for many years. And I decided to make a podcast. And the subject of the podcast was the school shooting that I survived when I was 15 years old. And not only did I want to tell the story of what happened, but I wanted to tell the story of what happens after. We see this stuff on the news and we're like, oh, that's so sad. And then we just move on and we forget that this sticks with people. This trauma is something that stays with you for the next decade, for the next 2 decades, for the next 3. It's something that will affect every piece of my life for the rest of my life. And so I interviewed each member of my family. And it was the first time in 15 years that we talked about where were you that day. And I took their stories and I turned it into a form of narrative storytelling. So it's not like this podcast where it's like a question and answer setting. You're actually listening to actors perform the parts and taking you through the journey of what happened before, during, and after. And so yeah, it's an audio drama is the idea. It was like the main form of radio, like back in the early days of radio, but it's like not such a thing in contemporary podcasting. But it was very successful. It hopped into the top 2.5% of all podcasts globally within, I want to say, a month. And so I think that it is a story worth being told. It's a story that people are interested in. And it was a really powerful experience for me to create the project, and it's called the Foreward podcast.
So I'm curious how the title came about, because I love the idea of like kind of exploring the aftermath, especially since it is such a powerful portion of people's lives ongoing forever. Why Foreward?
Sure. Well, it's a play on words. It's actually a made up word. There is no word that is Foreward. It's a combination of the word forward, like the forward of a book, because it's just chapter 1 in a long series of stories. I plan for there to be many more seasons of this. I'm writing currently the script for television. The idea is that I don't want to just explore the day and the thing that, a lot of people are like, oh, that's exciting, I want to hear that story. And it's like, for me, what happened after was in some ways more interesting and more important in terms of how people heal and how they cope or don't. And then, obviously forward is also the idea of moving forward. What does that look like for people? So it's, it's both iterations of the word and we put them into one.
That's a great title.
Thank you. My brother came up with it. He's a smart guy.
In the family storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting that you said you hadn't talked about it really for about 15 years with your family, and so it's definitely obviously something that continues and lingers. How was it just like even introducing the topic after so long?
I was nervous about it. I didn't know what my family would say or if they would be open to the idea of me sharing our story so publicly. And pieces of the story have been fictionalized, of course, because I'm not inside of the heads of my mother, my father, my brother. So I had to make up pieces and to make it all, fit together. But in general, I tried to represent the true stories as much as was possible. And I was really surprised when I sat down to have these conversations. This was, like I said, early days of COVID. And so we sat outside on the front porch and we sat 6 feet away from each other. And I said, can you tell me about what happened that day? And what they actually told me was what happened the next 15 years. And so they sat there. I want to say my dad sat there for like 6 hours. And then he showed up the next day and talked for another few hours. And it was something that we needed to talk about and we had never discussed. And in his instance, like he wasn't in the building that day, but what does it feel like to be an adult man who's supposed to be strong and your children and wife are inside a building where a hostage situation is taking place? Like, what does that do to his psyche, and no one had ever asked him and no one had ever kind of unpacked, well, how did that affect your life for the next decade? And when I asked him, he wanted to tell me that, and something similar happened with my mother and my brother. Like it's not just the story of that like one day, and that one day is important, but there's so much interesting stuff that follows, that we each healed in different ways. We each like experienced PTSD in different ways, and then that changed every year. And it just manifested differently for each of us. And it was really interesting to hear what parts of our story were the same and what parts were really different.
It's very fascinating to think about that, because as you said at the beginning, it's something that people easily forget. It's like it's the event and then the event is over, and just because it's off the news or we move on, some of us move on to the next event, it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away for the people that were in the building and the people that were outside of the building.
Exactly. And it's become such, unfortunately, a commonplace event that a lot of people have experienced hostage situations with active shooters. And so there's a huge percentage of our population who's walking around having witnessed this horrible thing that will affect them indefinitely. And we're acting like that's not a part of our culture or part of our society in the United States.
Yeah, that's especially difficult. A lot of like the more traditional ideas on like PTSD tend to go around like combat and people who have been in combat, and that, which is not a different situation, and it's also not the only situation in which traumas can come up. And like you said, like it's not even having to be in the building. There's so many people around that just get affected in the community. That sticks with you, and everything will change your brain chemistry with something as significant as that. So I love the idea of like just diving into all of the other aspects of it that aren't the sensationalized pieces, the ones that are just the ones that really affect people's lives ongoing.
I think I told you guys this explanation, but a therapist once explained to me the different types of PTSD. And there's one type, if you have a traumatic event and then you're able to like remove yourself from that and never go back, and like that type people tend to eventually heal from. Then there's the type that you're talking about that veterans have when they go into battle, but then they're forced to keep going back in. And a lot of times psychologists think that school shooting survivors have that type because they have to keep going back into the building where the murder happened over and over and over and over again. So the way it was explained to me is that PTSD in the brain, your memory should be metaphorically in black and white. They should go into long-term memory storage. But a person who has PTSD, the memories don't go into long-term memory storage, and therefore they feel like it happened yesterday. So for many years, I'd hear a firework and be like, and duck for cover, because my brain didn't understand that it wasn't the same thing, that it didn't just happen, and that's not what's happening to me now. And it takes a long time and a lot of therapy to program or reprogram your brain, I guess, to not do that. But and for some people that probably doesn't ever go away. But yeah, it's just interesting to know that, like you said, it literally changes how your brain works.
Absolutely. And with people like the rest of your family and everything, how have they, was it helpful to get to talk about these things, to kind of process that some of these responses are still automatic or still trained in there? What was that experience like for them? And just, was it cathartic? Was it helpful, hard to do?
Both. I think in some ways it is probably re-traumatizing to think about that stuff that you've chosen not to think about for a really long time. There's a good reason we haven't thought about that stuff, because it's awful. It's awful. And nobody wants to think about that, but it's also, it's opening a can of worms. But I think for me, and hopefully for my family, it can be a healthy thing to explore that, because ignoring your trauma is not a solution. And I think that's what a lot of people in my community did. I grew up in a really small town in Colorado that was pretty conservative minded, and the idea of talking to a therapist would have been pretty taboo. So most people just kind of went like, we're so strong, let's move on. But that's not the reality, because it's just not how the brain works. And so I think in some ways, I've had a lot of people reach out to me about the podcast from my town that said, oh my God, I can't believe that was happening in your household too. It was happening in mine, and I had no idea. And you don't want to be the only person who says, I'm not okay, when your whole community is like, we're so strong. So you don't. And so you assume that everybody else is okay and you're messed up, when really we were all suffering in probably similar ways, and we didn't know that we weren't alone.
I particularly love about this project. I mean, it's incredible vulnerability on your part to jump in and be the one to basically raise the hand and be like, look, I'd like to talk about this, and just, go through some of the ways this was. And then it has created, as you were saying, like a platform where the community you were in gets to respond to this. It's kind of incredible how large the story can become when you just give that the initial permission.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm sure, like, I mean, not everyone is comfortable with the idea or wants to explore that, and that's okay. And I've had people reach out to me and say, I don't think that's a healthy choice for me to listen. And I'm like, absolutely don't do that. Please don't do that if it's not going to be a healthy choice for you. But for me, it was extremely useful and probably the best therapy that I've ever done. There were a lot of moments in creating Foreward that were really profound and disturbing and upsetting and cool all at the same time. The one that's coming to mind is when I directed the actor who was playing the part of the shooter. And it was, I can't even explain. It was so weird. It was so weird. And it was during COVID, right? So I had like a room that was my recording studio. So I was in a different room than him. But when he arrived, we rehearsed for a little bit in the backyard, 6 feet apart. And we had this conversation, and I said that it was really important to me that when people listen, that they don't just go, this person's a villain and they're bad. I want them to understand that we need to have empathy for this person because he was very troubled. And to be a man who is an adult man and who is a smart man, who his whole life has had his mind working, and now he's hallucinating, and he literally doesn't know what is real and what isn't. And he's homeless, and he doesn't have anyone to go to. And like, that would feel so horrible. And I want that to be communicated through your performance. And he said, I want to do that. I want to do this to honor the victims of the crime and the family of the perpetrator. And I was like, whoa, that's like never even crossed my mind that man had a family. They're probably still in Colorado. Like, so it was just already weird. And then he goes into his room to perform his part, and I'm trying to coach him through this horrible scene and tell him, I need you to say these words like it's the last words that ever came out of you, that you've been depressed your whole life and it never got better. And what would that feel like in your body? And it just comes out of his like horrible way of like, you should have just left me alone. And he's like shaking, and I'm shaking. And then he's done recording his part, and he goes out on the front porch, and this is COVID times, mind you, so I'm staying far away from people, and he just like wraps me up in a hug, and I'm just like, my brain can't handle this because I'm associating him with this horrible person, and yet I know that this is a person who's a sweet person, who's an actor, who's not the real person, and I'm hugging him, and I'm just, I don't even know how to explain like how weird it was for me and how just strange that it was. Like, for the first time ever in my life, I felt some sense of forgiveness of like, I what he did was very, very wrong, obviously, but I don't have to let it control me for the rest of my life. And I never got that until that moment. And I don't know, the whole thing was just like some huge life lessons for me. Forgiveness is not a thing that I generally do. So for me to even consider the idea of feeling that emotion towards someone who really profoundly affected me and my family's lives, it was like, whoa, like this is a sign that work has been done.
That's incredible. So many things that you just described, like the need of, the learning about empathy, like true, like full empathy, not just empathy for, I guess, more, I guess, easier or on the surface empathy. But something like he was a human too, and he was suffering, and he had a family, and he was alone, and having that level of empathy is incredible, and experiencing that. And also, and you mentioned that a couple of times, this with the community as well as him, this just aloneness and what it does, and how it just truly destroys people from the inside. And so when you think about the pandemic, or even when you think about, a lot of what's happening in the world now in the recent years, how many people feel alone, and how many people are shamed for that, even in the workplace, we see it all the time. It's just like,
Absolutely.
just go in your corner and do your job. You don't need to talk to people, or, but it's the impact of that behavior. It's destructive.
Totally. And it's interesting to think that, like, for the three of us, we have a certain amount of privilege that if we feel very lonely or if we feel depressed, then we probably have resources at our disposal of people who can help us, or we can take time off work if we need to, or, not everybody's in that position. And I can't imagine what that would feel like to go, I am not at liberty even to take care of myself in this situation when I feel that level of bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, and there's definitely statistics. I try not to read too much of the news or listen too much of the news because it's just not too healthy, I guess, when we get sucked into them. But even just a headline, I was reading headlines just in passing, going like looking for something else. And it said how depression in youth is increasing even more, which has already been increasing in an astronomical amount. And a lot of it is the loneliness, is the feeling of being alone. And even though we have the resources, not knowing how to turn to them.
Sure, definitely.
I think it's incredible that you've got like this platform that people can kind of do that, and you've got that for yourself. I mean, they talk about in trauma processing, there's kind of slowly exposing like pieces or similar, situations where you understand there's more control over it, where you can kind of slowly reprogram. And it sounds like you've had many of those moments in that, and it's kind of cool that the idea that like you created a whole storyline around this. Now people kind of have their own platform to interact with this, even if they don't have the resources or don't feel comfortable reaching out to somebody. You can still find some catharsis, find some kind of shared story just that exists out there. That's a very potent.
And it's been so far reaching. I mean, it's just kind of blown my mind. I think it's like streaming in like 40 countries. Like right now, like it's been a while since its release. It was released on New Year's Day. And it's like climbing the charts right now in Saudi Arabia. And it's the thing, like when I released this, I thought like a lot of people aren't going to be able to relate to this. And I was so wrong, because everyone has experienced something very difficult where they had to like figure out their way through it. And honestly, I have been really shocked to see that most people have specifically a trauma involving either some sort of mental illness for themselves or someone that they love, or a shooting situation, or like almost every actor was like, oh, well, I had a child who was in a lockdown situation and I didn't know if it was real or not. Or I was a doctor in the blood bank when the Arapahoe shooting happened, and that was my experience. Or I just checked my brother out of his program for schizophrenia, and we've been dealing with that as a family. It's like, the themes are a lot more relatable than I guess I thought they were going to be. And people like very, very far and wide have reached out and said that there's some part of the story that they can relate to. And that's been really cool.
It's a great example of just how tied up everything is. I mean, everything is so connected, so much farther than we see. I mean, you see the building, the story, the one day like that, but every piece of the community is impacted. Like that story about the doctor. I mean, you never tend to hear about the stories and rarely even think about, all of the different ways that something is connected. I remember there was some exercise they wanted kindergartners to do where they would take like their box of crayons and then figure out what went into like making that. So you had to kind of think about like all the people that made the wax, that made the ink, that made the printing machines, etc. I mean, how wide just this thing that we take for granted is, and on something as major and easily obviously logged into memory as a traumatic event. It's the impact just is so much wider than I think we can comfortably comprehend.
Absolutely. It's extremely like exponential, and the degrees of separation are much smaller than you think. Because even, a student at my school, obviously they're going to be affected one way, but it also affects their coach, their boss, their sibling, their grandmother. That, it's when something like that happens to someone that you care about, it affects you too. So I feel you. Mm-hmm.
Well, then adding the complexity that even two people experiencing the exact same situation, even if they're in the same area, like the totally different reaction, totally different like, feeling out of it.
Oh, that's been some really peculiar conversations, because some of the things I depicted in the podcast, like one of the stories that pops into my head is after the shooting, there was a group of volunteers who were handing out teddy bears to the high schoolers as they were going back into the building for the first time. And for me, that was just like, this doesn't make sense. Like contextually, like, why are you giving me this? Like, I felt like I was an adult because I grew up like overnight. So I'm like, why are you like, my brain, like it was not a positive experience for me. It just felt like, bad. And then another woman who I went to school with reached out to me, and she was like, that was like the kindest thing anyone's ever done for me. And that made me feel safe. And she said, I reverted to feeling more childlike after the shooting, because that's how I coped. And so for me, it was really helpful to have that experience. And I'm like, oh, like I didn't ask anybody else about what that felt like for them. Like some of the stories are, different people's perspectives. And so you do see like different people respond very differently to different things. But in that particular one, I was like, I hadn't even considered that maybe for someone that was a really great experience. And yeah, you're right. It's not, it's not consistent across the board because we're human and we're all different.
Mm-hmm. And it's another example of how empathy really works. Is just because I feel this way, that doesn't mean somebody else is going to feel this way. And so the only way to find out is to ask.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the tremendous value in creating space for that kind of thing, because you don't know who's going to react or how they're going to react. And I think that's one of the reasons that we end up doing things like, well, we're a community, we're strong, we're basically moving past this, like, because trying to interact, like there's no one size fits all help out there. There's everybody's interpreting this differently. We have trillions of neurons going on, and everybody's got a different reaction in this one, informed by our previous experiences, etc. I think it's something we end up avoiding, but there's that kind of simple solution would be like creating a lot more space around that. And I love that you said about that, Christina, because that empathy really does, I think, create a little bit more like, I don't know if this is helpful for you. I just, it's like, being near somebody who's grieving, you want them to have the space and just know like, hey, I'm here. I don't know what will help and not. I don't know if you want to just wait. That's fine. It's a very important, I think, and very difficult, because even in just like, typical conversation, we're not super comfortable with a silence, a pause. And even then, like, and then to add in the more heavy context, it becomes, I think, that much more difficult to go create that space, but so much more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of not the whole situation, but just talking about the empathy and creating space is with my kids. I'm trying to do that, and it's really hard as a parent, because you want to solve problems, you want to make them feel better, you don't want to see them go through pain. But I've learned, when they fall or they cry or they're upset, instead of jumping into let's do this to make you feel better, or have a treat, or whatever I think they need, I just ask them. I just sit and ask, what would help you right now? Do you want me to stay? Do you want me to go?
Have either of you read the book Untamed by Glennon Doyle?
Yeah.
There was a chapter in that book that just like knocked the wind out of me. Mm-hmm. And she was saying that she was telling the story of like when something traumatic happens, she compared it to the job of a flight attendant. And she says like a flight attendant's job when there is turbulence is to say like, I'm here with you. We're going to get through this together. Flight attendant can't fix it if that plane's going to crash, but they can be present and they can show up and they can say, okay, whatever happens, here we go. And we're in this together. And I was like, what a cool thought exercise for any of us when we're going through something difficult with another person, to say like, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to do it with you. Because a lot of the time we don't know what the answer is, but just, bearing witness and showing up and being present, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I think we put up so much pressure on ourselves to come up with a solution, as if we're supposed to either know the answer or count on the other person to have the answer and not get in their way. And I think exactly what you said is a very powerful statement. Just the, I don't know what we're going to do here, but we're here. So we're in this one together. We're going to have to like keep moving forward together, but I'm going to just acknowledge right up front, I don't know what to do.
Yep.
So the storytelling that you've done in the podcast from clearly your personal experience, but that's part of a lot of what we talked about when we met earlier, on how that's kind of what you have been focusing on in your life, is just, getting the stories, understanding people through their stories. What drives you to that? What draws you to the story part of people's lives?
Well, I guess I've just always been interested in human psychology in general, and just intrigued by like, what is it that makes us tick? Why do we do the things that we do? And I studied film in school. I've worked in the film industry most of my career. And it's interesting to me that like the same stories keep getting told. And often they're just like dumb stories. And then they make 15 versions of the same dumb story. And it seems to me that there's all these really interesting stories out there that aren't being told. And then this one seems like, well, duh, it's like such a common story in our culture. And like, why? Like, I assume it hasn't been told because it's controversial, or perhaps because survivors aren't telling the story and it would feel inappropriate for someone to tell the story who wasn't a survivor. I'm not sure, but I feel like there's just so many like stories that need to be told that aren't. And it was really exciting and empowering to say, I don't need someone to hire me and tell me to tell this story. I can just make it on my own, which is why I chose the format of podcasting. Is, like I said, my background's film, but it might cost me $10 million to make the TV version of this, which hopefully will eventually be created. But it was feasible for me I hired 70 different actors. We recorded each of them individually and in that little room separate from me during COVID. The whole thing, it was crazy. But anyway, I was able to do that with a very small team of my actors. And I hired 2 editors to help me put it into its final form. And we just did it. So it is exciting to realize that, like, I don't know if there's a story you want to tell that you don't have to have anyone's permission to tell it. You can just tell it.
It is your story.
Yeah. And we all have one, right? I mean,
yes.
I think if you really take the time to have a deep conversation with somebody, everybody has an interesting story. Everybody does. And maybe it's a good thing to write it down. Yes. And if you're really wild and crazy, then make a podcast out of it.
Yeah.
Have you thought about doing that? Sorry, go ahead, Christina.
No, I was just saying, we definitely all have stories that we may not think are interesting if they're not big, newsworthy.
Have you thought about like storytelling in other aspects of your life, and just has this come up? I mean, it's such an incredible experience, especially for this large experience. But in any other stories of your life, or witnessing other people's stories, how do you find yourself interacting differently now?
I guess the thing that pops into my head, which is probably not a good thing to say, but now everything horrible that happens in my life, I'm like, this is going to make a great episode. Like, like, oh no, something awful just happened, and this is going to be great storytelling. But yeah, I mean, when you're telling your own story, then you start to see your own events in your life as like, oh, that's very climactic, or that's ironic that happened in this order. But yeah, I mean, we'll see where all of this goes and where it takes me. I have a bunch of seasons of this drafted of the same story as it continues throughout time. But you're right, it has inspired me to pay attention to other people's stories in a different way. And I never knew I had a love for script writing until this project. And so now that I know that that's something that interests me, I'm sure there's lots of projects on the horizon with lots of different people's stories, I hope.
I love that answer. I heard, actually, it was David Sedaris, the humorist. His quote on it was something like, I feel really bad for people who aren't writers, because if something bad happens to them, they just kind of have to live with it. Yeah. But if you're a writer, you're like, oh, well, this will make a good story.
It's good content.
Yeah, I get to write about this. And so I do love that answer. I think that's a perfect summation. And I think it's great. Like, it's a good way. They say, like, one of I was listening to a podcast on the guy who helped develop like the 5 stages of grief, he came back later and they were thinking about coming up with like a 6th one, which is really, beyond acceptance, you start to find meaning. And I think that this is kind of a good, unique way to really start to feel meaning, and it helps you understand something in a larger narrative very quickly, which is a lot easier for a human brain to like process, I think, than just trying to sit with it or compartmentalize it and leave it alone and not have it tied to the rest of our lives.
Do you remember what that podcast was called? Someone just sent me something similar that I haven't listened to yet. That sounds really interesting.
I think it was one of Brene Brown's podcasts.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like one of the first Brene Brown podcasts I listened to.
Okay. She's so smart.
She is.
I think
talking about storytelling.
Maybe someone just sent me a Radio Lab on the same, they were, whatever it is, it's like, it's on the 5 stages of grief, but then they realized that they needed to talk to people who were grieving, not just people who were dying. That's originally apparently how they formed it. I don't know if it's the same thing or not, but anyway, I have some podcasts to listen to. Yeah,
it sounds familiar.
It's David Kessler, and he was on Daring Greatly. It's on grief and finding meaning.
Cool. I'll listen to that.
Super interesting, because he also has a bunch of has a lot of interesting stories just of his own, but that one is I think a cool context of remembering, like, that's, it doesn't mean you're happy with anything that's happened. It doesn't mean you suddenly like have good feelings or something. It's just that you find meaning, you find where this plugs in, and you tie it in, and it doesn't feel like this like isolated piece of your life anymore. It doesn't have to be this thing you don't want to touch because you've tried your hardest to leave it separated.
Yeah, and sometimes we do realize that when we're in the middle of something, usually when it's lighter, maybe still hard, but lighter, and we do acknowledge, one day this will make for a funny story. Because we know that once we're past the 6 stages of grieving, it'll come up as a funny story.
Yeah, that's a fair note, that it's like when things are lighter, because I'm not trying to make light of the story I told, because it is not, I hate it when people say that thing about like, well, everything happens for a reason. It's like school shootings do not happen for a reason. That's a messed up thing to say. It doesn't happen for a reason. Sometimes horrible things happen.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's how it goes sometimes, but I don't know, that's one that bugs me when people say that. No, or they'll come up with the silver linings, and it's like there is not a silver lining. Come on now, like not of this situation. I had a therapist ask me that. Like, I went to therapy like one time as like a young person, and I didn't go back until 15 years later. And she said something about to the effect of like, write down the silver linings. And I'm like, free therapy? Like, what? That's a dumb question to ask a 15-year-old who just went through like the worst day of their life. That's just silly. Like, what? Anyway, sorry, maybe that's a pessimist in me. I just want to clarify that I don't mean that like the shooting's a funny story. It's not a funny story. Not what I meant.
It's never gonna be light.
No, not that one. Not that one.
No. Well, and that sounds a lot like the toxic positivity that is coming out lately as a hot topic, as an acknowledge. It's always existed, but now we're actually acknowledging it, that it may not be all that helpful. And it's that, like, everything has a meaning, and look at the silver lining, or just get past it and move on. And it was another podcast that I heard, and I can't remember who it was. I'm sure it was Brene Brown, but that they talked about how when something traumatizing happens, there is no such thing as moving on. There's moving forward, which goes back to the title of your podcast, because you're taking it with you. It never goes away. Moving on means you just, pack it in a suitcase, put it in a closet, change houses, change states, and you're done. It doesn't happen.
Totally. My friend Jenny told me one time, she said Americans are really bad at grieving. And it made me think, because I was like, well, what does that mean to be bad at grieving? What does it mean to be good at grieving?
Yeah.
But we don't, as a culture, we don't try to move through things. We try to move around them and sideways and do everything in our power to distract ourselves for as many years as possible until we hit a wall.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not being good at grieving. It isn't.
Yeah, grieving is a whole other topic for sure, because it's that, and then there's a lot of numbing, to avoid the grieving. Then there's the numbing, whether it's working all the time, substance abuse.
That was me, was working all the time. I became like absolutely obsessed with my career and just ran myself ragged in doing so. And that'll be the next piece of the next season of the podcast is, how each of us coped. And that's how I dealt, was like distracting myself like crazy and working till 3 a.m. every single night. But you can only do that for so many years before you're sick and you're tired and you've ruined all your relationships. And, like it's not a long-term solution. It's not sustainable.
It's not at all. I actually went through some grieving coaching for again, something much lighter, like leaving a job. But a couple of years ago, and it always turns out to be a lot like therapy and life coaching. It turns out to be that when you hire somebody for for the help that you think you need, it has nothing to do with what you actually need to grieve that you never have. And so I remember my grieving coaching tell me that I'm like, okay, we'll grieve the fact that you left your job and community and friendships and whatever else happened in that period. And with, very quickly you realize that that's not what you need to grieve. It may be, but there's deeper traumas, there's deeper things from your past that you haven't grieved because we don't get taught how to grieve, like you mentioned.
Right.
We get taught how to
not intuitive.
Move it aside.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. You'd think we would have like a course in school or something. I like 3 years ago is when my grief finally caught up with me. So I ignored it for that long. And it finally caught up with me such a long time later. And I did go find a therapist and I said, like, help me. This feels bad and I don't like it. And how do I fix it? And so not only did we do therapy, but she like taught me how to grieve and said, like every day you're going to come home from work and you're going to go on a walk for 30 minutes, whether you like it or not, because you need to move and you're feeling depressed right now. So you need to eat a specific diet that is healthy things. It's Mediterranean. So it's colorful foods like salmon and berries and vegetables and whatever. And whether you like it or not, you will go stare at the stars for 30 minutes so that you can find something that's larger than yourself because you need to find meaning. And I just, whether or not I thought what she was saying was dumb or cool, I just did it, and it did work eventually. And it helped me like actually go through the process of sorting through some of the stuff that I had ignored for my whole life, and it worked. But nobody taught me how to do that up until that point. I didn't know that was what you're supposed to do. And like, how would I have come up with like, oh, you're depressed, so eat salmon? I'm not going to know that just willy-nilly from my brain, like,
or don't work all the time, or don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, she had me like schedule blocks on my calendar of like, you will do nothing or you will not work or you whatever. So I could remind myself, don't do that. Like, yeah, it's a real thing.
I think back to what you're saying about the some of the toxic positivity things about people saying, well, find the meaning, or everything happens for a reason. Those are definitely triggering and unhelpful, I think personally. But also because of that, like that's the kind of the societal message. You end up feeling like you should be moving forward all in itself if you start to feel like you should do anything as opposed to what you are feeling. But that I think ends up trapping it exactly. Like it's much easier than you just start to numb as a reason to try and get to what, especially I think in American culture and probably larger as well, just we have that tendency to be like, well, we've heard we shouldn't be focusing on this for too long. We should be focusing on the positive. And all these are very dismissive and very like, well, let's just put it away. And I think it's and
what Christina was saying.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just Christina earlier was saying like there's a lot of ways that people numb themselves up, and like that's part of what the podcast was talking about, is that afterward like things got really bad. Like there was a lot of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, teenagers having sex before they really were ready or wanted to. There were car accidents and suicide attempts and successful suicides, and people find whatever their drug of choice is to distract themselves or to create an altered state for their mind, and it looks different for all of us, but it's no matter how it manifests, like it's the same thing. It's numbing, it's distracting, whatever it is.
And it's not always obvious. I remember going through the process with a grieving coach to figure out what she calls STIRBs, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's what I tend to do when I'm grieving. And at first, like you answered the question, I'm like, oh, I watch, tons of movies, like fictional movies, like superhero movies, like to take me away from reality, or I go window shopping or some of those things. And then she was like, okay, those sound that they're common. And then she was like, okay, so what did you do after, you left your job? And it was right before Christmas. So like until Christmas, what did you do every day? And I'm like, oh, I cleaned out my whole basement. And she was like, and there it is.
Yep.
That's what you do. You spend 10 hours in the basement to go through every single box, clean it out, look at pictures, do whatever. That's how you grieve.
Mm-hmm.
And so now it's like, I know, like when I start cleaning obsessively and I have to like reorganize a whole entire room, I'm like, okay, what am I grieving? What loss just happened that is, driving me to do this for 2 days?
Totally. And yeah, that's an interesting thing you say, because I had a therapist who said when you do things compulsively, then it's something that's worth paying attention to. Because I would be like, I'm relaxed, I'm gardening, but I garden until my hands bleed. And it's like, that's not relaxation. That's doing a behavior in a way that's compulsive. And that isn't healthy, no matter what it is.
That's a really good point. I definitely can recognize just in myself random compulsive behaviors that always end up stacking up when I'm like just avoiding some kind of stressor. And I think it's been shocking to me just in rethinking about this. And I really love your entire idea of the podcast and the many seasons to come on this because of this. That if we don't start to listen to those and get the help and try and understand what the stressors are, this isn't just something that like, it'll plague you for a little bit and then, it comes up. This can be decades. This can be years. I mean, this can take long amounts of time, and you can find lots of different expressions to keep it down. And it's pretty shocking sometimes to think about how long you can let that go. It's not as easy as you'd think just to like know about it or to have it, suddenly come to a head.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of sounds like you eventually reached that head when you went to the therapist. And I gotta say, it's kind of relieving to know that like, walking, watching the stars, and a Mediterranean diet are all part of the healing plan. So that sounds awesome.
Helpful. Well, what the therapist was explaining is that a lot of people believe that your gut and your brain are actually very like interconnected. I don't totally understand how this works, but that's what she was saying is like if the bacteria in your gut are weird, then you might be doing something and causing an imbalance in your brain. I don't know. Maybe it's hoo-ha. I don't know, but it helped. Something helped. I don't know which of those things helped. Maybe all of them helped. Maybe 2 of them helped. I don't know, but it doesn't matter, at the end of the day, that's something in that process got me out of my funk, and that I can appreciate.
Yeah, the power of storytelling, something that happened personally, and then revisiting it in the way that you did.
Yeah, that was certainly I don't know. It's hard to explain because it was such a weird process, but like, it's one thing like when you meet a new person as a school shooting survivor, like it's just like part of my history that if I don't disclose, it's weird. So you have to learn how to give a Cliff Notes version of the story to be like, oh yeah, this happened to me. And then now let's not talk about it. Let's move on. Or when an employer goes, oh, is that where you're from? Did that happen to you? Then you give the Cliff Notes story, and then you're like, I don't want to talk about the lips, And so in making the podcast, it wasn't the Cliff Notes version. I had to rack my brain to remember every single detail and additional details that I did not know from reading police reports, from talking to my family, from interviewing other people in my community. And it's literally like the writing is the stuff of my nightmares. It's not things that I like usually would share. It's extremely vulnerable. So to look those stories in the eye head on was a lot. It was a lot, but it was also important because if not for the podcast, I would not have revisited that stuff. Probably not, at least not to the extent that I did. And I think that in some ways it was important for me to go back and kind of re-experience that and put some of it into context. And there's a lot of things that like that I thought in my brain, I was like, oh yeah, that's how that went down. And then to have someone confirm like, yes, that is how it went down, or no, I remember it differently. Like that was a really interesting experience. The whole thing was just bizarre, but it turned out neat, I think.
Necessary.
Yeah, necessary for sure.
I mean, from sitting, across the Zoom table here, there's a lot of incredible hope in your story and incredible just vulnerability to it. And truly, thank you so much for jumping in and sharing this with us. It's very moving and very. It's just really cool to see how I'm not gonna say well because that sounds like a value judgment, but just how much you've done and how much you continue to do. It's very cool to see, and it's very fun to witness.
And thanks for being up for the conversation. I think that these kind of conversations are what's going to break our culture out of feeling like you have to be okay all the time. And, if for me, like one of the primary issues that I tried to explore in this story is that, sometimes we're not okay and you should be able to say that. And I think that, exploring these sorts of topics is really important. And I think our culture is shifting in that direction right now, which is very exciting. But I think these sorts of platforms are going to keep it moving that direction. And I think, that's really something. So thanks for being up for the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely not an easy one, and to have to keep talking about it. It's a continuous revisiting of some parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This may be a somewhat heavier answer than sometimes we go for, but we'd love to just kind of ask people who come on what authenticity means to them, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Authenticity. What authenticity means to me. I guess I don't know. I have like a really neat circle of friends at this point in my life, and it took a long time to find them. Like I'm not the kind of person who like in high school that I had like my crew that's still my best friends. Like that didn't happen. I found my friends like midway through college and then continued to collect various oddballs over the years that mesh with my oddballness. And now we are this cool group of unusual and interesting people. And I think that is something that all of my friend circle has in common. They're all different from each other, but they are all extremely authentic, genuine people who show up and they don't pretend to be somebody else. They just are who they are. And we all honor that in each other. I think to be called an authentic person is probably like the biggest compliment you could give somebody, right? Like we live in a culture where a lot of people like make it their goal to be like, I'm cooler than I am, or I want to look different than I am. And it's, I don't know, there's just not enough hours in the day. Like life is short. Why are you doing that? Like, and maybe it's a side effect of like having been through some like heavy stuff that it's like, what are you doing? Like this may end tomorrow, like, or like we may have a day or we may have 20 years and we don't know. So I don't know. I think being authentic is extremely important, but I don't know. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. It takes courage to be authentic, right? In a world where a lot of people aren't, but I think it's important.
Yeah. It gives life meaning. Because then it's like,
that's a really good point.
Like, what are you doing with your life? I'm like, well, if you don't have to ask that question if you're being authentic.
That's true. That's a good like aha moment for me that yeah, totally. That's cool.
I really love the phrase unique oddballness. I think that really encapsulates it. I think that's perfect.
Yep.
Definitely does. Yes. And I like that the thought is very close to my definition of authenticity, where it's not just about me being authentic, but it's about the group allowing and making the space for everybody to be authentic and be fully accepted as that.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm like most proud of in my friend circle, that like nobody's afraid to show up and be exactly who they are, because we know everybody else in the group's gonna like lift that up. So yeah, it's a really cool feeling to be at a point in my life where I'm surrounded by people who are all like that. And you get to choose who you surround yourself with. And I feel lucky that I'm at a point in my life where like I get to pick. And if someone's not being that, they don't get to be in my circle.
It becomes like a duck, goose game. And you're out.
Yeah. Life is too short.
It is. So it should be fairly easy for everybody to find your podcast, but where can people find you and your stories?
Sure. Well, like I said, Foreward is spelled funny, so I'll remind you one more time. So if you go to forewardpodcast.com, you can find it, FOREWARD. It's also on iTunes and Spotify and Apple Music and all the places. So anywhere you want to find it, you can find it. It's on Instagram, it's on Facebook, it's in all the places. So anywhere you want to find Foreward Podcast. And my name is Taylor Fraser. So, hopefully there's more things to come with my name on it in the future. We'll see.
Yeah, we look forward to the Netflix special and
I know.
Movies and TV shows and podcasts.
It's in the works. I'll keep you posted on that.
Yes, please do.
Yeah.
You definitely have 2 more fans here. And thank you so much again for joining us. This is truly great to be able to share this with you.
No, it's great to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for listening.